Interpretation of data.
University of East Anglia, we are very much looking forward to your debate. Are you with us tonight?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
How have you had the chance to, follow up the US election up to this point?
Yeah, of course. We're checking Google, we're checking BBC, we're checking all the sources and seeing how everything's going.
And how is the climate there in New Zealand?
Sorry, we're in the United Kingdom. And the climate here, it's tense, but mostly because we are on really close to our own lockdown. So it's more about national struggles rather than international news.
Absolutely. We are very much looking forward for your discussion, and you have the floor now. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening from the University of East Anglia in Norwich. Welcome to the Academic Live Review on the role of religion in US politics. My name is Yinjen, and I will be moderating the debate. Our team is formed by Professor Lee Marson, Megan Free, Ellie O'Donnell, who will be behind the cameras, and of course, Joe Eastoe and Rebecca Wakefield. If you're ready, let's start. Let's start with something simple. What are the predictions for the election? Who will win? Let's start with Joe.
Not America. Well, Biden's ahead in the polls, but as we've seen, the polls are remarkably inaccurate at predicting elections. If we look at just the UK, if we looked at the polls, Brexit wasn't supposed to happen, and Corbyn was supposed to suffer a horrendous defeat in 2017, and he didn't. There was supposed to be a close election in 2019. Corbyn suffered a defeat. And of course, in 2016, Hillary was ahead of the polls, but Trump still won. But there are two reasons why this election specifically is a difficult one to just trust the polls. The first is that the US has the Electoral College. So a lot of news outlets like to say that Biden is 8 points up, 9 points up, 10 points up, but this is national polls. And most votes don't really matter, because unless you're in a swing state, unless you're in a battleground state, your vote won't really change the outcome. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that if someone stops you in the street and asks you your opinion on who you're going to vote for, and there's a particularly controversial candidate, you may either withdraw and choose not to take part in that poll, or you may go for the more mainstream moderate candidate to avoid judgment. But when it's just you and the ballot box, that's the only time that it really matters. That's the only time that you're free of judgment. And so when we have a candidate that is as polarizing as Trump, this could be really problematic. So at the moment, I won't call it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Lee, how about you?
Okay, 2016 taught us never to predict anything, I think. I mean, if I were forced to sort of stick my neck out, I would say that I think Biden will get it. I think the record turnout, I mean, this is the best turnout there's been for 100 years. I think Joe's quite right in terms of people how they respond to the pollsters. And I think particularly Trump supporters, there's not just the nervousness about sort of saying you support Trump. I don't really think that's the issue. I think that the issue really for a lot of people is that they don't like pollsters and they don't like the media. And so to spite them, they won't give any information about how they're going to vote, because this is the deep state who they are opposing. But I think the alienation that women feel, particularly about this particular president, I think we'll see a shift towards Biden. And I think the key demographics as well, obviously our section is about religion and US politics. I think the key demographics there are not so much the conservative evangelicals, but will actually be white Christian voters, so white Protestants, white Catholics, and the sorts of percentages, around 60% or so, who voted for Trump in 2016. We're not going to see those numbers. And I think because everything is such fine margins, we've got about 4 states, key states, which are 1% margins, another 4 or 5, which are sort of 5% margins. So, it's finely balanced, but my hunch would be that Biden will get it.
Thank you very much. Megan, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm leaning a lot more towards Trump getting the victory. I can't make it proven wrong, but I really honed in on his in particular. The people are so close. I think Oregon is going to be absolutely conservative. I'm also happy to consider so it's very rare that an incumbent president doesn't get a second term, and I just think for all of these reasons and many more, I think Trump will be elected.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't quite catch all of Megan's. I hope her audio is okay. Maybe it's just me. But yeah, it's been a very difficult one. All week I've been delaying trying to call it because of how close everything has been and how unreliable we've seen polls to be in the past. However, with the early projections coming in this evening, from those early exit polls, I'm beginning to have some more confidence that I think Biden might just take it. Even though it's very close, there is a consistency among sources like CNN and the BBC that Biden is just edging ahead. And so I'm suspecting that trend will continue.
Yeah, thank you. Now, let's look at the history of the US from the very beginning. It is known that the first colonies were founded by immigrants escaping religious persecution, and that the First Amendment reassures religious freedom to its citizens. During the past decade, there is a growing reliance of the Republican Party on the vote of Christian communities in a country founded on the separation between church and the state. Having considered this, would you say that the US society seems to be in conflict with its own democracy? Lee, you got the floor.
Okay. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think separation of church and state has been obviously very much part and parcel of American society. But separation of church and state doesn't mean that the church stays silent and that it is just kept to the private sphere. Christianity in particular, but other faiths as well, have been influential throughout American history. And it becomes a contentious issue when there are key issues, particularly conservative evangelicals have sort of issues around social issues, moral issues, as they see it. That's where it becomes really contentious. And so you will have secularists who are sort of arguing really that religion should be put back in its box, and religious actors saying that they can't disaggregate who they are, their faith, from how they actually pursue their politics. So I don't think that's a problem. Particularly it's something we're perhaps not as used to this side of the Atlantic, where we tend not to do, well, in polite company, you don't do religion or politics. That's what we used to say. In America, you do both.
Yeah, thank you very much. Megan?
Yeah, I agree with Lee. I certainly don't think that religion.
Yeah, sorry, Megan. I think we have an issue with your sound. Do you mind checking if everything's all right while we change to Joe?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Well, one of the things to talk about when we talk about separation of church and state and the founding of the history is that we like to think, especially in Europe, that the separation of church and state is designed to protect politics from interference of religion. But in the US, especially historically, it was designed for the other way around. These were Puritans that were escaping religious persecution, and they wanted to set up a society where politics would not interfere with their religion. So it's kind of the opposite way around. Another thing that Lee touched on is he mentioned the private sphere. And it's something that political philosophers like to talk about quite a lot, a division between the private and the public sphere, what kind of things should go into politics. But people just don't act like this. You don't divide yourself through the private self and the public self. You have a self. So if you have, especially in a liberal democracy, a very high level of religiosity, it's expected that you would have a political landscape that would reflect it. Like if you are religious and you're worried about religious issues, you're going to reflect this in the ballot box. So that's why religion is still very prevalent in US politics.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Hi, yeah, I just have to agree with everything that's really been said already. I think when you have a religious text that says things like the love of money is the root of all evil, or like there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, for you're all one in Christ Jesus, I think it's impossible to ask a person to separate that religious text and that religious practice from the way that they behave in the polling station. And so I think the fact that the Republican Party has been so heavily reliant on Christians and especially the evangelical section of Christianity might be slightly contradictory to traditional Christian theology. However, I don't think that's Americans contradicting the values upon which the country was formed. I think those are two slightly separate issues.
Thank you very much. Megan, is everything all right on your side?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
I was just saying how much I agree with Lee's point that politics and religion doesn't necessarily have to be conflict with one another. The audio is still okay?
No, we can hear parts, but not the whole entirety.
Okay, it's fine. Just move on.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question until Megan is able to speak. We know for a fact that evangelicals will be a prominent community in this election. Catholics, on the other hand, tend to separate faith from their political choices, as polls suggest. On the last election, 52% of the Catholic vote went for Trump, in contrast with the 50% that gave Obama his second-term victory in 2012. Do you think Catholics will support this election? Who do you think Catholics will support in this election? Sorry, Joe.
Well, according to polls, it's going to be Biden. So 70% of white Catholics support Biden. 68% of Hispanic Catholics, the prominent religion in the Hispanic community, support Biden. So it looks like it's going to be Biden, but it used to be Catholicism used to be a very sure base for the Democratic vote up until about JFK, up until about late 60s, 70s, and then it started splitting. But in the last 50 years, whoever has won the 75% of the time, whoever's won the majority of the Catholic vote has won the presidency. So we talk about bellwether states, but the Catholic vote really is a bellwether religious vote, if such a thing exists.
Yeah, thank you. Lee?
Yeah, I don't think it's sensible to talk about a Catholic vote as such. I think there are at least two Catholics. There's the white Catholic vote, which has been going for Republicans for a number of years, and then there's the Hispanic and basically non-white Catholic vote, which will go Democrat, and that tends to sort of balance itself out in terms of the 52% that you mentioned earlier on. The sorts of figures which are being bandied about, 70% of white Catholics voting for Biden, I don't buy that. I just don't see that happening. But there will be less support for Trump, I'm sure, Catholics. And it is interesting. I mean, they don't tend to sort of, their faith doesn't really determine how they vote in the same way as evangelicals. I mean, one of the sort of the tests really for how people are going to vote, you'd ask them how they feel about the economy, whether they think it's going well or it's going badly. And that will give you an indication of thinking. Do you feel better off or worse off? Then the third question you ask is, how often do you go to church? And if you find that you're going to church more than once a month, if you're thinking that the economy is going great, you're better off than you were, and the opposite would be true for Democrats. And Catholics will sort of have a mixed view, I think, in terms of depending on where they're coming from, how well they and how good and confident they feel about their own sort of prosperity or status, and how they feel about the nation as well. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to lump them all together, then this time I think we could sort of see them move into the Biden camp.
Thank you very much. Now, let's take some time to review the US history and see how everything goes on Megan's end. Thank you very much.
Good night, my name is Ellie. I really hope you're having a wonderful evening so far. Before we can really make sense of the role religion will likely play in this election, we must first explore its significance in the United States. I hope to provide you with a better understanding of America's religious past. There were already at least 500 different Native American religions in existence when Europeans first had contact with the Americas in 1492. Native American religions were rich and diverse, being central to many people's identities. If tribes did collide, they would often adapt their faith when faced with different beliefs. European colonists rarely appreciated this complexity. Missionaries viewed Native American religion as monolithic and primitive. Many European expansionists believed they were on a mission to save savages from across the world from sin. They believed that by converting the world to Christianity, civilization would spread to all continents. Although many Native Americans did eventually adopt Christian beliefs and traditions, missionaries were struck by their reluctance to do so. By encountering the other, colonists were forced to acknowledge Christianity as problematic in many ways. Natives also modified Christianity to fit their own needs by mixing Christian rituals with their own traditional ways. The emergence of these syncretic religions demonstrates how Native Americans were not passive subjects in the colonization process. By the 18th century, Christianity was the dominant faith in the Americas. A series of religious revivals, collectively known as the Great Awakening, took place in the 1730s and 40s. The movement was born out of the widespread belief that the colonies had strayed from the church. America's evangelical tradition can be traced back to this movement. Sensationalist preachers, known as New Lights, used tactics to arouse fear. Critics of the revival argued that preachers threatened established institutions and political stability. Evangelicals portrayed the New World as predestined to become God's kingdom on earth. Their teachings further distanced America from European Christianity, which was heretical and rife with controversy. This spurred republicanism early in the nation's conception. The Declaration of Independence was drawn up by Thomas Jefferson and signed by the other framers on the 4th of July, 1776. The document is scattered with references to Christianity. The Declaration asserted that the Creator grants all men sovereignty and unalienable rights from birth. Jefferson portrays a God who surrenders his powers to the people, allowing them to build a nation which protects these rights. God gives the American people freedom to seek life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, without insisting that the United States must be a Christian nation. The framers insisted that men can follow any religion or no religion at all if they abide by the law. America's secular tradition can be traced back to this point. The Ku Klux Klan has existed since the mid-19th century and is still in operation today. The KKK adopted the term WASP, or WASP, to regulate who they believed were true Americans and could be recruited. The acronym stood for White, Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. The Klan asserted that only people who fit this description were truly American and respected the principles of the white Protestant framers. Many Protestant parishes showed support for the KKK, particularly in the South. Clergy who opposed the Catholic Church and its ethnically diverse congregation would collaborate with the Klan. Reverend E. Robbins, a pastor in Rochester, Vermont, spoke of his support in 1923, claiming, "The Klan stands for 100% Americanism. It stands for the sacredness and the purity of the home. It stands for the maintenance of our public schools and the Bible in the same. It stands for the Protestant Church and the Protestant religion." The Ku Klux Klan demonstrates an interplay between religious affiliation and national identity. Christianity was used by the Klan to carve out a national character by discriminating against those who did not fit the mold. The Civil Rights Movement is an excellent example of how religion was used in the 1950s and 60s to drive social change. African American churches spread their message of equality through freedom songs, adapted from gospel hymns, and by drawing on Bible passages. Scripture calls for believers to love their enemies and to turn the other cheek when they are wronged. Black religious leaders were instrumental in the Civil Rights Movement. One such leader was Martin Luther King, who initiated a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955. He went on to establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. Here, King employed the Christian values of love, equality, and justice to overturn the Jim Crow laws in the South. In contrast to Martin Luther King's calls for peaceful protest, the Nation of Islam argued that black emancipation can only be achieved through violent means. The group asserted the superiority of black people, that the United States must be made a black Islamic country, and that Christianity has been used by Caucasians to oppress non-whites. In the 1960s, one of the most influential spokespeople in the Nation of Islam was Malcolm X. He used the platform to express his anger about racial inequalities to the public. After a clash with the group's leader, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X left the group, became a Sunni Muslim, and began preaching about the need for peace and equality regardless of race or religion. He was assassinated in 1965, just a year after departing the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X can be credited with raising the consciousness of African Americans, especially at a time when slavery and segregation were still fresh wounds. The civil rights movement and other social movements of the 1960s received backlash from those who feared white male hegemony was being threatened. At this time, the political right went through a revival. The Republican Party and evangelical Christians became closely aligned throughout the 70s. In 1979, Jerry Falwell, founder of the Moral Majority Group, used his television show to increase evangelical support for Reagan in his presidential campaign. Reagan's rhetoric drew in evangelicals who agreed that the nuclear family is enshrined in the Bible, abortion should be outlawed, and Christianity should inform state policy. Even today, evangelicals make up a huge part of the Republican Party's following. So, early in the 21st century, the United States was targeted on home soil for the first time. On the 11th of September 2001, the world was shaken by a series of attacks on New York's World Trade Center, along with various government buildings. The Islamic fundamentalist group Al-Qaeda later claimed responsibility for the attacks. Western civilization has othered Islam and Muslims for thousands of years, considering the religion to be at odds with Western values. Historically, Islam has been conceptualized as inferior, primitive, and immoral in contrast to Europe and North America. By viewing Islam and the Islamic world as an enemy of the West, Islam is made a political ideology instead of a cultural system or religion. Although Islamophobia is an old phenomenon, the events of 9/11 caused prejudice against Muslims to soar. Institutional discrimination, such as restricting Muslims' employment practices, their access to healthcare and education, and by perpetuating negative representations in the media, prejudice became commonplace. There was also a spike in everyday discrimination targeted at Muslims, including vandalism of mosques and Islamic schools, organised Quran burning days, offensive slurs, and physical assault. Today, Islamophobia is still rife in Western nations. Religious symbolism can be found at every turn in the American political sphere. References to the Creator in the Declaration of Independence, the adoption of "In God We Trust" as a national motto, and the use of the phrase "One Nation Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance all demonstrate Christianity's influence on American politics. Tonight, we'll be exploring the role religion has played in 21st century politics. Themes I have discussed will likely pop up again and again as we examine the current presidential election. I have included all cited works for anyone to browse over. If you have questions about anything covered in this segment, please do not hesitate to contact me on my email. That's all from me. I'm going to pass back to the panel now.
Thank you very much. So after this short presentation, let's move on to the next question. In a more specific manner, polls also show that the Hispanic Catholic community has always leaned towards Democrats. It was only last year when there was a slight tilt towards the right. So now Florida, a swing state which turned red in the last election, has a prominent Hispanic Catholic community. Which party do you think will win Florida this year? Megan?
So I'm quite convinced that the Republicans will get the majority that they need in Florida because of Latino support for Trump. And it's actually gone up by 35% according to The Independent from 22% that he got in 2016. So I think that will push the Republicans kind of over the finishing line in Florida because it is seeming to be such a close race there. And also what's particularly interesting about Florida as well is the growing support with college-educated Hispanics in particular, and the fact that there is a concentration of those voters in Florida as well. So I'm really convinced that it's going to go red this time.
Now, Joe, would you like to add something?
I'll disagree with Megan. I think it's going to go blue, and I think the Hispanic vote, especially religiously, Catholic Hispanics are still favouring Biden. They historically favoured Democrats, but they're still polling 68% for Biden. And the big issue with the Hispanic vote is that they are notoriously the lowest ethnic group in terms of turnout to elections. But reassuringly, it seems like turnout is on the rise for this one, and we're seeing record numbers. So I think this will have an impact on turning Florida blue.
Interesting. So, Lee?
All right. Tempted to say it's going to go purple. And hedge my bets, having sort of stuck my neck out on Biden before. I do think this one is really, really very close indeed. I mean, I think I probably would go, Megan, I think probably a narrow squeak for Republicans on this one. But Biden doesn't need Florida, I don't think, to win the White House. I mean, basically, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida with a 1% margins. If he gets 3 of those 4, then he's in the White House, I think. But in terms of the Hispanics, it's a very diverse community. You've got the Cuban exiles, in particular, who will certainly be backing Trump. Hispanic Catholics, probably backing the Democrats. There's Hispanic evangelicals. Are going to be pretty evenly divided, but more sort of leaning towards Trump than been the case earlier on. So it's going to be nip and tuck, and I really can't call it. I don't think. We just have to see how it plays out. Sitting on the fence, terrible.
Okay, so Rebecca, what do you think?
I think I'd have to join Lee in the middle of the fence for this one. It's probably too hard to call at this stage. As he said, like the Hispanic vote is not a homogenous one. There's a huge amount of variety within it, and Latin America is a very large country to be drawing people from. And you have to remember that religion is a huge influencing factor for people in that community in Florida. However, other things that Trump has done during his presidency, such as the his treatment towards immigrants in particular, has been fairly shocking. So I think when you consider those factors and then the high voter turnout as well that we haven't really expected, there's many things at play, and I'm not sure that we quite have enough statistics specifically on this community to know exactly which way this high voter turnout is going to have affected them.
We've got different opinions here. Anyone would like to add anything to their theories? No? Then let's move on to the next question. House Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, when politicians use faith as an excuse to pass and uphold laws that seize control of people's bodies, but do not guarantee their health care, feed the poor, shelter the homeless, or welcome the stranger, you have to wonder if it's really about faith at all. Many Republican-leaning news journals accuse AOC of promoting socialism through Christianity. Do you think that is the case? Lee, let's start with Lee.
Yeah, I mean, I think socialism has been used as a catch-all word, which basically means that they're not Republican. And so it's a slur for people. But, this side of the Atlantic, things are seen as a little bit different. I think the gospel is essentially a socialist message, and AOC has got it absolutely right. I think what we are seeing is a shift in some of the more progressive evangelicals who are worried about being tainted with the evangelical brush, which has basically now come to mean Trump evangelicals rather than just evangelicals. And so you're finding movements like pro-life pro-life evangelicals for Biden would be one group where, and I think that encapsulates really what AOC is suggesting, really, that if you're pro-life, it's not just a matter of being pro-life about what goes on in the womb. It's actually being pro-life from conception through to death. And issues like poverty, issues like homelessness, domestic violence, racism, guns, and sort of so many deaths through gun crime. Those issues really do matter as well. And so being an evangelical, being a Christian, is actually about having that concern for every part of people's lives from birth to death. And so she's got it right. But, I think probably the conservative evangelicals who are criticising and the Republicans who are criticising are not just criticising her, they're actually criticising the gospel they claim to believe in.
That's interesting. Joe?
One of the things that Lee highlights is how socialism is such a scary word in the US, and it's quite a difficult thing to get your head around in Europe. But there was a Gallup poll that asked people, would you still vote for your candidate if they were X? And then they listed a bunch of ethnicity, sexual orientations, political positions, that kind of thing. And the lowest percent was just 46, I think, saying they would still vote for their candidate if they were this, was socialist. So it really is a scary thing for Americans, and that's why these conservative newspapers are trying to conflate AOC's fairly sound argument with the boogie word that is socialism as kind of a way of dismissing it out of hand.
Great, thank you very much. Megan?
Yeah, I completely agree with Joe and Lee. And just to point out as well that AOC has herself said that she's a democratic socialist, but I don't think in any way that should be used to be dismissive of her opinions and disregard that. And particularly because it discourages people from being critical thinkers and actually have an opinion on the substance of what she's saying. But again, I completely agree with what she's saying in reference to these pro-birthers, in their hypocrisy and their kind of lack of consistency in applying those same Christian principles to people who are already born.
Thank you very much. Coming up next, we have a video showing the past presidential candidates and their impact. Let's move on to the studio. Thank you very much.
It's year 2000, the beginning of a new century. The United States enters the new year with Democrat Bill Clinton in his last term at the Oval Office. A year goes by, and the Republican George W. Bush is elected as the 43rd president with a campaign based on faith, tax cuts for higher incomes, pro-life declarations, and a bigger defense spending. Just like his predecessor, President Bush serves 2 terms from 2001 to 2009, with a much clearer victory on his second run. History repeats itself with the victory of the Democrat Barack Obama, making him the 3rd president to be elected for 2 terms in a row. With a campaign focused on minimalizing military intervention in foreign countries, universal healthcare, and providing protection to undocumented immigrants, Obama not only won the race vote, but was also favored by religious communities in comparison to his Democratic successor Hillary Clinton. Now, how did that happen? How could a Democratic candidate alter the voting pattern? How did President Bush maintain the increasing trust between Christian communities and the Republican Party? Let's find out. For President Bush, religion is a constant presence in both his personal and political life. Previously, he has spoken unapologetically about his spirituality. His search for spiritual guidance as a Methodist convert aligned perfectly with the agreement among evangelical believers that the president should have a strong Judeo-Christian faith. Tragic events such as 9/11 and the following invasion of Iraq also reinforced the need of a Christian leader in the Oval Office. America needed his administration, and this potentially paved his way into a second term. His pro-life and anti-LGBT stance concurred with the traditional values of many evangelical voters, ensuring the support of a community who actively participates in politics for another 4 years. His victory on the second term became an important reflection of the gradual shift towards the Republican Party many evangelical communities are experiencing. During the last decade, these communities have been drifting apart from the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, it seemed like this conservative viewpoint did not last much longer, and the role of faith took a turn with the arrival of the 44th President of the United States. The arrival of the 44th POTUS raised an important question. How much weight does religion actually have in the US politics? Along with the votes of other people of color and religious communities, Obama gained a fair share of Christian support by addressing to the growing community of Democratic white evangelicals and Catholics. The difference is remarkable. It was only 4 years ago when Catholics favored Bush over Kerry by a 5-point margin, in contrast with a 7-point margin supporting Obama against McCain in his first election. Within the Democratic Party, Obama obtained 26% and 21% of the votes from white evangelicals, while Hillary Clinton obtained only 16% of the votes from the same community in the 2016 election. Regardless of the transparency of the Obamas, when it comes to their faith as Protestant Christians, the amount of conspiracy theories surrounding the religious beliefs of the 44th POTUS increased during his presidency. Polls shows that 1/3 of the conservative voters still believe that Obama is Muslim, despite numerous proofs debunking this rumor. His approach to religion also seems to differ from that of President Bush, who relies on his faith to get him through difficult times, while Obama saw faith as a moral guide.
From the time of our nation's founding, people of faith have shaped America. Throughout our history, faith has been a powerful force for good in our communities and our families. So faith isn't just a footnote in our nation's story. It reinforces the very essence of America. As someone who values the role of people of all faiths in American life, I'm always touched by the amazing stories of love, service, and compassion that take place in this country every single day. They reinforce the power of my Christian faith, which has guided me through my presidency and in my life, as a husband, as a father, and as president. This job is full of tough decisions, and at the end of every day, each president needs to act based on what their values are and what they believe. I know faith is often used as a wedge in our politics, and with a new election year come new attacks. In a democracy like ours, there will always be disagreements on important issues, and honest debate is healthy and constructive. But the American people should know this. In a changing world, my commitment to protecting religious liberty is and always will be unwavering. As America's religious diversity grows, we have the chance to reaffirm the pluralism that has defined us as a nation. A pluralism expansive enough to protect the rights of all to speak their minds and to follow their conscience. E pluribus unum, out of many one.
However, this distinction seems to have very little effectiveness in voter satisfaction. His stance on reproduction rights, immigration laws, and stem cell research turned the conservative side of these religious communities away. An insatisfaction towards the administration that might have led to the victory of the Republican candidate Donald Trump in 2016.
Well, now that we're halfway through, let's address the elephant in the room. New polls show that coronavirus has deepened the faith of many US citizens, interpreting the pandemic as a sign of God. Do you think this might have an impact on the presidential election? Rebecca?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think deepening the faith is a very interesting word. I think it absolutely will have an impact on the US election, but depending on which state you're in, I think that exactly what deepening could be very different. If you're right in the middle of the Bible Belt and you're going to a very conservative white evangelical church and living in a very conservative white evangelical family, then your interpretation of deepening of the faith is very likely going to work in Trump's favor. Whereas for voters in other states, possibly spending less time in churches that might have preached a conservative evangelical message, and more time at home, perhaps with a more liberal family, reading over a Bible and reading, Jesus's message of loving your neighbor, then maybe a deepening of your faith will have gone towards Biden, especially with everything that's being compounded with the Black Lives Matter movement. A deepening of your faith could definitely mean a rejection of Trump in that light. And so I think it definitely will have changed opinions for some voters on how they will interpret the election. But I just think that word deepening will have meant different things to different people.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Lee, you got the floor.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Rebecca mentions there, really. It's horses for courses, really. I think what is interesting is that people who perhaps not traditionally associated with churches are also being impacted by coronavirus. And so you've seen right across America a record numbers of people tuning in online to services, even if they've got no connection with the church at all. So I think that's quite an interesting phenomena that we're seeing. I think people's spirituality is being sort of developed, really, and opened up by prospects of what the pandemic means. In terms of coronavirus actually affecting the election, as well as sort of people's faith, I mean, it already has affected the election. We've got over 100 million postal or drop-in votes, even before voting started today, which, I mean, it's just incredible amount of people engaging with this. So, yeah, I mean, it's whether it has a lasting effect in terms of people's faith, we'll have to see. But there's definitely an increased inquiring and seeking for answers, really. From your different perspectives. I mean, the evangelical perspective might be this is God's punishment in some way. But other people's perspective could be that actually it's nothing of the sort, but God is actually within us, within this sort of pandemic, and somebody who you can turn to in this time of crisis, really. So, yeah, horses for courses, but it's definitely impacting how people feel.
Yeah, thank you. Megan?
Yeah, I completely agree with Lee and Rebecca. And I think Trump, with his COVID-19 strategy, which is essentially anti-federal, has further secured his voter base. But I think the issue that he's going to have is with moderates and undecided voters. Particularly as we've just touched upon, the Hispanic community, a third of them actually think that the coronavirus is the biggest threat to the United States. So that actually might steer and kind of go against those waves of conservative, religious Hispanics that we were talking about that might be so essential in those key states. So I think it will be really interesting to see kind of which way it will go and how this in particular will affect the Hispanic community.
Thank you. And Joe?
Well, as Lee pointed out, coronavirus has and will impact this election. Whether it'll have a knock-on effect on people's religion and that will then have a knock-on effect on how they vote, I don't think it would be noticeable. I mean, it is a sin to view all religious people as the same. But if people are going towards religion, this would, on the whole, favour the Republicans. But Trump's handling of coronavirus has seen a lot of criticism. So this could see people moving away from voting for Trump. So I think overall that should kind of balance itself out.
Thank you. Now that we've touched the role of faith in morality, let's jump to the next question. Donald Trump is the antithesis of what all Christians stand for. So why do white evangelicals support him? Lee?
Okay, because he's not the antithesis of everything that Christians stand for. I mean, Christians acknowledge that they are sinners, and he's one of them. He fits in quite well. And I think I think that's certainly true in 2016. But I think there has been a change in Donald Trump, not in terms of his personality or his character, but in his acceptance and openness to conservative evangelicals. So he's just come out as saying he's no longer a Presbyterian, but is non-denominational. Well, when you declare yourself non-denominational, what you're saying is basically you're an evangelical in an American context. And so he has sort of shifted his opinion. And, I haven't got a lot of time for his attitudes and his approach, but, he does appear to be, exactly what the moral majority opposed in over decades. Those sorts of attitudes, the misogynist way, the adultery, the personal attacks on people, having a poor character, basically. And that hasn't changed. But what has changed, I think, is that moral majority have now become sort of an embittered minority within the country. And he is very little different to many of the other people who have this same attitude towards their political opponents. So, yeah, there's all types of Christians in this world. And, Shane Claiborne, who Rebecca interviews later on, and we'll see that clip. One of the things which he sort of emphasizes all the time, really, is what she emphasizes all the time is just how different some people are in terms of being Christians. So he will sort of contrast people from his hometown compared to where he lives now. Still all Christians, but with a very different approach to the world. And Trump is a Christian, I think, but he gives Christianity a bad name.
Rebecca, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Similarly to Lee, I think the idea that Trump is the antithesis of Christian belief, or the Republican Party is the antithesis of Christian belief, and therefore on the opposite end of the spectrum, Biden must be sort of semi-deistic, or or his party is the answer to their problems, or the other way around, that Biden stands against everything that Christianity stands for. Either of them, I think, is an unhelpful binary. I think the reality is that Christian voters are making the same choice that all voters are making at the moment, which is that the Republican Party meets some of their beliefs and that the Democrat Party meets some of their beliefs, and the Republican Party fails them in some ways, and the Democrat Party fails them in some ways. I think essentially they can take Trump's failures easier than they can take Democrats' failures. I think that Trump offers them greater freedom of speech, and he offers them more seats at the table when it comes to decision making on key speaking issues like abortion rights. And so for that reason, they think that he's an easier pawn in their game of chess, so to speak. So I would say that that's why, even though he really, and you're totally right, Yin-Yan, he does not match up to a lot of the core values of Christian faith, he's much easier for them to control, and that's probably what wins it for them.
Joe, anything to add?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons why he gets support from Christians. One of them is because of Pence. Pence brings with him a large evangelical group. Trump's not a particularly devout man, but when you've got a vice president that is devout and sticks his neck out and says, give this guy a chance, as he did in 2016, this will bring with it support. And in the last 4 years, we've seen Trump do the things that, especially for the Christian right, are the things that they wanted him to do. So he's currently threatening to revoke the 1973 Roe versus Wade bill on abortion. He removed LGBT health information from federal websites. He changed the embassy, that's the one, the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And these are all things that the Christian right wanted to be done, or especially white evangelicals. So that's why he gets quite a lot of support from Christians.
Does anyone have anything else to add?
I'll just quickly add that I think this really encompasses the push and pull between Christians either prioritizing personal piety or religious influences over policy. So with white evangelicals and their close proximity to the president, they're able to exert an overwhelming amount of influence on his policies. And just one example of that is the Johnson Amendment. And I think because of that influence, it doesn't necessarily matter if Trump deviates from what Christians stand for, because policy is their priority, not necessarily morality.
Yeah, that is actually quite a point. Let's...
Could I just chip in? Just in terms of equating Christians with evangelicals. I mean, Christians are a very diverse group. And I think because obviously they're quite a fascinating group, conservative evangelicals and the people who've really backed Trump. But there are other groups, particularly Black Christians, Black Church, which also are important actors in all this. 80% of white evangelicals will end up voting for Trump or thereabouts, but 90% of Black church members, Black Christians, will end up voting for the Democratic candidate. So there are different groupings, and so lumping everybody together is a bit difficult, I think, to do. So just to sort of put that sort of caveat in, really, when we're looking at Christian actors.
Okay, thank you very much. So coming up next, we got breaking news. So let's hand everything back to the studio.
Thank you. So we're now starting to see a real bulk of the results coming in, and I've been monitoring CBS carefully to see the latest figures. Some key states for the evangelical states in this race are coming in through with their results now. At the moment, CBS are reporting that President Trump has won several electoral votes in Oklahoma, a state he was expected to win by double digits. He's currently winning by 7. He's also won Tennessee and Kentucky. These aren't surprise wins, as they have previously been Republican stronghold in the past, so we're seeing nothing new here. And currently in Texas, there's a potential shift, as Biden is currently leading 49.5% to 49.2%. These results look extremely too close to call still and could sway either way in the near future. Texas are again another predominantly Republican state, with Trump supporters seen out over the weekend ambushing Biden campaign buses and ganging up on Democratic supporters. These actions weren't condemned and even encouraged by the president. Associated Press are reporting that polls have just closed in Arizona, Colorado, Kansas, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, New Mexico, New York. Polling indicates that Arizona could go for Biden, but Democrats have their eyes on an even bigger prize. If Texas, with its 38 electoral college votes, go to Biden, the path for victory for Trump becomes almost impossibly narrow, and the US political map will be remade. Associated Press have also just reported that Trump has won Arkansas, Indiana, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Joe Biden has won New Mexico and New York. And these again aren't surprising wins so far and fit in with the typical voting in those states as well as political predictions. Figures from Associated Press currently show that Biden is leading with 119 in the electoral votes against Trump's 92. But again, it's still too close to call at this point. BBC are also reporting now that Republicans are currently leading with seats in the House. The Republicans have 60 and Democrats 40 so far. Democrats currently hold the House, so it'll be interesting to see if there's a big shift in these results in the coming hours. Another report from the BBC is about some disruption in Pennsylvania. After what seemingly has been a fairly quiet election so far, there's starting to be a bit of disruption. It's been a mostly quiet election day, but a small wave of unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud and dirty tricks is being aimed at the crucial swing state of Pennsylvania. One video has showed a poll watcher being denied entry to a Philadelphia polling station, which has been shared by multiple pro-Trump accounts on Twitter. The man in the video was asked by officials to wait outside, with a woman telling him that his citywide poll watching certificate was not valid in that particular polling station. Similar videos have also been shared using the popular hashtag #StopTheSteal. One seemed to show pro-democratic signage inside a polling place, a rules violation, but local authorities made it clear that the sign was far enough from the voting. These incidents come a day after President Trump himself posted false claims about voter fraud and how it could lead to violence in the streets in Pennsylvania. Twitter labelled his tweet as false and misleading and stopped it from being retweeted. With the rise in the gun sales in the run-up to the election, CBS have also reported about the concerns about the bitterly divided state that the US finds itself in, as there were fears of violence and disruption on Tuesday. However, things seem to have gone in a different direction, as there have only been a few reported incidents of run-ins at polling stations or in the streets, with Pennsylvania being the very few of the problems at the moment. In Chicago, a man told police that a group of people attacked his car with baseball bats near a polling station, but so far these claims are just the ones coming through now, with no major disruption being reported across any of the states. So far, we have yet to see more results come in, but we're sure to see more come in the near future. That's all from me for now. We will have more later. Back to you.
So after hearing that Texas, which is a swing state located in the Bible Belt, is actually being one of the key points for the Democrats, do you think to what extent has religion played a role in this election? Let's start with Megan.
Yeah, Texas is certainly a surprising one. I don't think anyone expected especially from the previous election, that it would go purple as people have been predicting it so quickly. But yeah, religion has definitely played kind of it's been an overlooked aspect, I think, of presidential elections, both historically and in this election, as a determining factor of voter behaviour. Yeah, I think a lot of voters understand, though, that if Trump is re-elected, then white evangelicals are going to double down on their policies, and this will have a lasting effect, I think, on kind of the religious agenda. And whereas under Biden, I do think religion will still have an influence, but I think it will not necessarily dictate policy as it does under Trump, and I think it will be more of an informant and, yeah, less dictatorish.
Yeah, so coming up next, we have Joe.
Well, Texas has been talked about as being one of the new swing states, but no one really expected it to happen this early, and I don't think it will happen this early. But one of the reasons behind this was a rising level of immigration in Texas and a rising number of young people in Texas. So that's why Texas is becoming a bit of a battleground state. But again, I don't think it will happen this election, but maybe in a couple of elections' time.
Right, so Rebecca?
Hiya. Yeah, in terms of how big the role of religion has been in this election, when you looked at the BBC early poll earlier on this evening, there was a suggestion that economy was the most important reason that I think people had been voting on, and then racial tensions, and then the coronavirus pandemic. And with all these big things going on in America, it does make it sometimes feel like the role of religion is like greatly reduced this election compared to previous ones. However, I would argue that actually religion is, instead of being one of these issues that people are voting on, it's the lens through which people see things like the economy or racial tension. And so it's an underlying factor in all these things that people are voting on. And therefore it does have a very significant impact, especially in times of trouble, when, like we've previously talked about, people tend to come back to the roots of their faith and become more convicted. So I think this election, religion will be overshadowed, especially in media coverage, because of all the controversial things going on. However, I think we can't underestimate its impact. Yeah, in terms of the news about Texas, I would be highly suspicious that it will end up going Democrat. It's a very, very small lead at the moment, like a very small leeway. And with more votes yet to be counted, I suspect those will be Republican votes. So, yeah, I think Texas will be, Trump will hold on to Texas for now.
Thank you. Lee?
Yeah, I think there's a slightly artificial situation at the moment, probably surrounded by the counting of postal votes, which would have been done early on, which would skew things towards Democrats who voted, were more prone to use their postal ballots. But Texas has always been sort of a bastion of sort of conservative evangelicals, really, for decades now. You've got Robert Jeffress at First Baptist in Dallas, who's the lead, or one of the leading advisors and confidants of Donald Trump. You've got John Hagee from Christians United for Israel, who's also there, again, another person who's had influence on the president. If you think back to the midterms, there's a lot of fuss being made about Texas, and would Ted Cruz, who is a bona fide conservative evangelical, would he lose his Senate seat? And it didn't happen. Trump said it wouldn't happen, and it didn't happen because we're not at that sort of demographic shift that Joe mentioned. So, you know, I think this is flattering to deceive at the moment, and I'm very surprised to see Texas fall to the Democrats.
Thank you very much. Anyone has anything else to add? No. So then let's move to the next question. How will Hispanics and Black voters vote in this election? Let's start with Joe.
Well, historically, Hispanics and Black voters tend to pick Democrats, but the same issue that I highlighted earlier, they also tend to have a lower voter turnout. But this election seems to be a high voter turnout. So the Black and Hispanic vote could be essential if the Democrats want to win this election away from Trump.
Thank you. Lee?
Yeah, yes, I mean, they tend to vote Democrat. I think we're seeing this is the first election, or if not pretty close to it, where Hispanics are actually overtaken numerically Black voters, which will be interesting. But yeah, you've got Hispanic evangelicals who are tending to side with the Republicans, but the overwhelming majority will vote Democrats, and that's been a pattern that we've seen of late. I think the black vote and getting the black vote out was problematic for Hillary Clinton, where they did sort of not abandon her, but there wasn't the same incentive to get out and vote as there was with Barack Obama. This time, because Barack has sort of been out and campaigning very actively, you've had the churches, black churches, who've tended to sort of steer clear of the political sort of maelstrom, really, unlike sort of white conservative evangelicals, pastors who've consistently been involved. Then black pastors have not tended to do that. But this election, they have really sort of swung behind Biden and Kamala Harris as well. That's not insignificant that there's a black sort of running mate. And so this time, well, clearly the numbers are up in terms of turnout, and you'd expect black and Hispanics to increase their turnout as well in this election over 4 years ago.
Thank you. Now let's focus our attention on the vice presidential candidates. Now I'm going to hand over to the studio and let them play another segment.
There's not much between the vice presidential candidates according to public opinion. In a recent poll, 40% of Americans have a favourable opinion of Mike Pence, whilst 37% have such an opinion of Kamala Harris. A huge gulf does, however, appear when the public are asked their opinion on how religious they find the running mates. Here, Pence comes out with a huge advantage, as 37% of respondents found the Republican to be very religious, whilst only 3% thought the same of Kamala Harris, which is roughly the same level of perceived religiosity as President Trump. Pence's life has always been one steeped in religion. Raised as a Roman Catholic, he converted at the age of 19 to evangelicalism. He dedicated his life to Jesus, quote, "not out of a sense of intellectual agreement, but because my heart was broken with gratitude for what he had done for me on the cross." Republicans tend to publicly lean on their religion more than their Democratic colleagues, but even so, Pence is devout for a Republican, and he lives his life governed by religious thought. The 61-year-old often uses religious language in his speeches, so much so that if he's talking to a friendly crowd, you could almost mistake it for a sermon. In a speech in Indiana, he beseeches his listeners to trust in God, claiming if his people who are called by his name will humble themselves and pray, he'll hear from heaven and he'll heal this land. He now attends College Park Church in Indianapolis, who believe that real-life change is found in the Spirit-empowered Word, not in our ideas, thoughts, or opinions. God's Word is written in ink, whilst our plans and theologies are in pencil. Pence's presence in the White House has brought with it the re-wedding of presidential power and evangelical leaders. Just as earlier administrations played host to the religious heavyweights of Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell, his current halls are often graced by Robert Jeffress, Samuel Rodriguez, Jerry Falwell Jr., Paul the White, and many others, and a lot of this is down to Pence. Richard Land, the president of the Southern Evangelical Seminary and one of Trump's faith advisors, claims that Mike Pence is the 24-karat gold model of what we want in an evangelical politician. I don't know anyone who is more consistent in bringing his evangelical Christian worldview to public policy. Kamala Harris certainly doesn't speak about her religion as much as Pence, but it's usual for Democrats to be more private about their faiths and not wear it on their sleeves, and this shouldn't be mistaken for irreligiosity. Harris was raised by a Hindu mother and a Christian father, and she now identifies as a Black Baptist and attends the Third Baptist Church in San Francisco. Its Reverend Amos Brown claimed Harris was a spiritual person and a quintessential scholar. Speaking about how her religion influences her political life, Harris claimed, "My earliest memories of the Bible's teachings were of a loving God, a God who asks us to serve and stand up for others, especially those who were not wealthy or powerful." Harris attended both Hindu temples and Baptist churches during her upbringing, and she has an Indian mother, a Jamaican father, and now has a Jewish husband. It is this background that has led the Washington Post to claim that Harris embodies the future of American religion in a time of expanding religious pluralism. Ebo Patel, the founder of Interfaith Youth Corps, stated that now there are more Americans that are like Harris, mixed race with a background of lots of different cultural, ethnic and religious experiences. Both candidates have faced controversies due to their stances on religion. Last year, Vice President Pence was invited to deliver an address to Taylor University, a Christian evangelical college in his home state of Indiana. Dozens of students and faculty members walked out in protest, claiming the Trump-Pence administration policies, we believe, are not consistent with the Christian ethic of love we hold dear. Harris experienced backlash, mainly from the right, after introducing the Do No Harm Act in relation to the Religious Freedom Information Act. This legislation ensured that the First Amendment, the freedom of religion, could not be used to discriminate others based on race, gender, or sexual orientation. But some, notably the Christian conservative journal First Things, saw this as against the Constitution, running the headline, "Kamala Harris is a threat to religious believers." Despite their shared Christianity, Mike Pence and Kamala Harris's faiths have led to key disagreements over vital policies. At the vice presidential debate, the issue of abortion and the potential overturning of the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade legislation was discussed, to which Harris replied, "I will always fight for a woman's right to make a decision over her own body. It should be her decision, not that of Donald Trump or Mike Pence." Unsurprisingly, Pence took the opposing stance more aligned with the religious right, claiming, "I am pro-life and I don't apologise for that." Similar disparities can be seen in other key religious issues, such as stem cell research and the aforementioned Do No Harm Act versus religious freedom. But their record on LGBT issues is the starkest contrast. Harris has long been considered an ally to this community. She officiated the wedding of a lesbian couple who fought for marriage equality in California. She was also one of the 20 senators who wrote to Trump condemning his administration's removal of LGBT health-related material from federal websites. On the other hand, Pence supported defining marriage as between a man and a woman, claiming the deterioration of marriage and family would lead to societal collapse. He also rallied against letting soldiers openly identify as gay, voted against the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which he later amended after business communities complained that it would lead to a rise in discrimination and drive trade away. With such an important and, for all probability, a tightly run election, with presidential candidates that are divisive for many, the vice presidential position may hold more weight than normal. With the emphasis that is usually put on religious positions in the United States, these issues could just be key to swaying the election.
Thank you very much. Now let's watch the next video regarding the presidential candidates.
So this segment will focus on Biden's Catholicism and how it has influenced his politics, and also Trump's Presbyterianism and the seeming contradictions within that, and how this may undermine his evangelical vote. So Biden's Catholicism stems from his education in a parochial school, and yet unlike Trump's evangelicals, so Paula White, Robert Jeffries and Mike Pence, faith doesn't necessarily dictate his politics, or that's how he wants to be projected as being. And this distinction is particularly significant with Biden because his politics and his public persona are often so interpreted through his religion, and this is translated in his 2020 presidential campaign. And the underlying theme of that being, quote, that this election is a battle for the soul of the nation. And this authenticity, arguably, that Biden is trying to project doesn't go far enough in actively critiquing Donald Trump and showing the superficiality of his religious beliefs. And I think this shortfall of the Biden campaign is encompassed in a Pew poll that was conducted. So actually 59% of white Catholics either lean towards or actively support Trump as being the next president, which is only 1 percentage point lower than what he achieved in 2016. However, it is important to note that while this is the case, Biden actually in the same poll
would secure 40% of the white Catholic vote, which is the same as what Obama achieved during his 2012 re-election. But despite this poll, there are growing observations of Trump's, quote, immorality, his incoherence, his rage and incompetence, but I don't see that leading them into the Democratic Party. And this is according to Sean Casey, the former director of the US State Department's Office of Religious and Global Affairs. So even with this contrast of Biden's public persona and the growing realisation of Trump's incompetency, it arguably won't cause white, evangelical, Catholic or otherwise voters to vote Democrat. So in both 2020 campaigns, there have been attempts to reach out to religious-based voters of concern. So for Biden, he has the campaign Believers for Biden, which seeks to reach out to conservative Latinos, with a particular emphasis on people from Florida. And there are also attempts in this campaign to reach out to people of Irish, Italian and Polish descent who may have voted for Trump in the 2016 election. And whether there will be any degree of success coming from such campaigns is yet to be seen, but it will certainly be a point of contention and analysis at the conclusion of the election. And there are other organisations as well, such as the Catholic Vote, which have gone so far as to invest $9.7 million into actively criticising Biden's record on abortion and judges to prevent a Biden presidency. Certainly, religious voters can rely on Trump's quote-unquote record of upholding campaign commitments, such as the presidential executive order promising free speech and religious liberty, which was interpreted as, at the least, undermining the Johnson Amendment, which reinforced the separation of church and state by not allowing religious leaders to have a particular affiliation or active support for a particular political leader. And yet it still exists. And going further than this, there are even accusations of Trump mocking his religious voter base. So in Michael Cohen's text, Disloyal, he actually demonstrated a number of instances where Trump was sneering at pastors at a particular event. Whether such private degrading comments will actually have an impact on voter choice is yet to be seen, but it certainly demonstrates the blasé attitude of Trump towards the Christian right and, indeed, his voter base. Interestingly, their tolerance of Trump is not just grounded in politics, but also in theology. So in Andrew Whitefield's and Samuel Perry's text, Taking America Back for God, they argue that Trump is interpreted as a saviour of a bygone era, and that, quote, it's been prophesied well before the 2016 election that God was raising up Donald Trump, like the ancient Persian king Cyrus the Great, a pagan chosen by God for a purpose only he could accomplish. And because of this, even this close to the election, it is unclear where the loyalties of white religious voters lies. And although Pew polls may show that Trump is leading with white Catholics and white voters in general, Biden still has an overall lead in the polls. However, it seems that with such appeasements to such groups and with Trump's mockery of his own religious base, it may not be enough to swing voters to vote Democrat.
Now, after the videos, let's ask the team, how important are the vice presidential candidates in this election? Let's start with Joe.
Well, this election, the vice presidential candidates might be more important than before, because in this election we have two fairly controversial figures. And so if you're an undecided voter and you want to know if the Democrats or Republicans are right for you, and Trump hasn't swayed you or Biden hasn't swayed you, then the next person you look at is the vice presidents. And I think they've been very clever about who they pick. Obviously, Trump's picked with the same, stuck with the same person, but Pence was really what Sarah Palin was to John McCain. He was there to shore up the religious vote, whereas Kamala Harris brings diversity to stop Joe Biden looking like the old white man candidate.
Okay, coming up next, Lee.
Yeah, it matters this time round in particular because one of the candidates is 74, the other one's coming up for 78. And to be frank, they might not make it 4 years. And so the running mate becomes really important. We could be looking at that running mate as being the next president if whoever does get elected president doesn't last the full 4 years. So yeah, it matters, and Joe's right. Well, just in terms of the extra that it adds to the ticket to actually have a more diverse grouping of people, and yeah, Kamala does help to get out the black vote in particular. I think, but also any people, all people of colour, are going to be more inclined, I think, to vote for Biden because of Kamala being on the ticket.
Rebecca?
Hiya, thanks. I think the Pence is a slightly less important candidate than he was in the first election in 2016. I think in 2016 he was really great at proving to the white evangelicals that Trump was someone they could rely on for support on the issues that they cared about. However, now 4 years later, most Christians know how they feel about Trump, and he's exposed himself enough for people to see his character as a person of faith. And so I don't think that there's much that Pence can say that will either make them more for him or more against him. However, Kamala Harris absolutely is a key figure in this election. She is at least a little bit younger, and she speaks powerfully. I think her "I'm speaking" moment at her vice presidential debate really was some of the characters that a lot of Democrats wanted to see in a vice president. There was some order to the debate that hadn't been seen in the presidential debate, and so yeah, I think she really could tip some undecided voters over the fence.
How about Pence? Hello?
I don't think he'll be swaying many undecided voters this time around.
All right. Megan?
Is my audio okay?
No, it's kind of like fading away. So if you guys want to, let's move to the final question and see if everything solves meanwhile. So, will Donald Trump's support for Israel gain Jewish votes? Joe?
No, for three reasons. The first is that the Jewish vote has never really been Republican. It's always been fairly strongly Democrat, and still between 65 and 70% are intending to vote for Biden. The second issue is conflating Jewishness with Zionism. Just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you support Israel. But thirdly, and rather the biggest issue, is that his support for Israel was never for the Jewish vote. It's a white evangelical issue, and that's because they have a lot of strange theologies that all involve Jesus coming back and ruling for 1,000 years from his throne in Israel. So it was never intended to shore up the Jewish vote, and it won't.
Okay, thank you. Lee?
Yeah, yes, Jewish voters, they're the only white sort of demographic that won't vote or haven't voted Republican as a rule. So no reason why they'll change this time. They're a little bit nervous, I think, about Trump's. I think Jewish voters do tend to back Israel by and large, disproportionately compared to other sort of groupings. But they are nervous about conservative evangelical support or the Christian Zionist support for Israel because it comes at a price, and basically believe that Jews need to convert to Christianity. They all need to be taken back to Israel in order the Messiah to come again. So nervous about, but they also tend to be socially liberal and tend to be largely sort of urban centres, and people in the urban districts tend to be more liberal, more progressive, and Jewish folks are going to sort of follow that pattern, I suspect. So yeah, I don't think it will influence people, maybe at the margins, but not in sufficient numbers to make a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. So coming up next, we've got an interview made by Rebecca. And let's move to the studio and check it out.
Hello everyone, I'll be joining you today live from the broadcast. My name is Rebecca, you may have been introduced to me already, and I am joined today by the wonderful Shane Claiborne. He was born in Tennessee but is now living in Philadelphia, is the founder of the Simple Way movement and also co-founder of Red Letter Christians. He's an author and a speaker and an activist, and a real voice of wisdom into the current political climate at the moment, especially when we're looking at the role of religion. So we're absolutely delighted to have him on today. Hello, Shane. Thank you for coming.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, a lot of important things happening in the world right now.
Yes, a lot of important things happening in the world right now, and there's so much to talk about. But I guess firstly, to kick off, for people who don't know you, could you give us a really brief outline of how your personal beliefs are affecting what you're campaigning for and what's really on your heart this election?
Sure. So when you mentioned that I grew up in the Tennessee, that's the Bible Belt, what we call it here in the in the U.S., and I had a very sincere, authentic conversion to Christian faith. I always say I fell in love with Jesus, and then that really began to shift a lot of the ways I thought. And ironically, it's the more I read Jesus and the things that he said, and that's where we get our name, Red Letters. The old Bibles have the words of Jesus in red, but I read the gospel, and I began to see so many contradictions within the evangelical church, and that was kind of shaping my imagination, the way I thought about politics. And then I would read Jesus, and I, and those begin to be competing voices in my head. So, I mean, ironically, it's very true to say that white evangelicalism, the same people that led me to Jesus, have led us to Donald Trump. And they are the biggest defenders of Trump. And that's what I find so baffling, because it is actually my love for Jesus and my loyalty to Jesus that causes me to be so terribly offended by Trump, both his rhetoric, his policies, his priorities. They look very different from the things I see in Jesus.
Yes. Yeah. And in the US right now, that's a very contested topic, which is why we're so excited to speak to you today. I think the other question that I was just really personally interested to ask you is, obviously we're all a group of students filming from the UK, but you're really on the ground in the community in Philadelphia at the moment. What would you say is that atmosphere? I was just wondering if you could paint a picture for us about how people are feeling right now about this election.
Wow, it almost depends on where you are, because our country is so divided, right? So when I'm down south in Tennessee, where I'm from, it's very different from where I'm in Philadelphia. The political posters in the yards are different. But I would say that I feel like there's actually a scripture in Romans that says the entire creation is groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right? It's a really interesting image and I kind of feel like the earth is groaning and people are groaning. Thousands and thousands of people all over our country are in the streets saying, I can't breathe. And some of these divisions are are really fundamentally racial divisions. Even though it's true that like 80% of white evangelicals have been the base of support for Trump, when you look outside of the landscape of Christianity, 80% of non-white Christians are against Trump. So it's more racially driven than it is by a faith thing. And I think that becomes so important, or otherwise we just hear Christians support Trump. But the truth is, white Christians have been supporting Trump, and Christians of almost every other part of the landscape of Christianity are very, very deeply concerned about Trump.
I guess also we're compounding all of the current political events with Trump and with Black Lives Matter with this coronavirus pandemic that's going on. How do you think churches have responded to this kind of new world that we're in? And do you think the church is taking a more political, do you think churches are taking a more overtly political stance now? What have you seen in the church communities that you've been around?
So I think what's happening is there is a renewed sensitivity to life and to how fragile it is and how precious it is. Many folks know people who have died because of the pandemic, and I hope that what it does is sensitize us, with a little bit more empathy and a little bit more compassion. And a real dedication to stand against death and to be advocates for life. And I mean, here's the irony, is that I grew up, everybody talked about being pro-life, but really only thought about that in terms of one issue, abortion. And I often say we'd be more accurate to say we're pro-birth or we're anti-abortion, because the minute the baby's born, everybody forgets about it, And so I think that the irony that America is a place where you can say that you're pro-life and still be pro-guns, pro-military, pro-death penalty, anti-environment, anti-life on almost every other issue. But as long as you got things right on abortion, you're good to go like that. But that's where I think a lot of folks are realizing that if we care about life, if we believe that every human being is made in the image of God, we need to be more robust in that commitment to life. And the gun violence epidemic in our country, 100 lives a day lost to guns, that matters to God. Every one of those is a child of God. The death penalty is one of the most scandalous things, that it's survived in America, not in spite of Christians, but because of Christians. Wherever Christians are in power is where the death penalty has held on. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So in the middle of that, we have the pandemic, and the people who are being hit hardest are people of color. Are communities that are in poverty. My, friends of ours who are on the street, they can't, quarantine or stay at home. They don't have a home. And so I think part of what we've got to do is be really sensitive to those who are most vulnerable right now.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like there's a lot close to the surface at the moment. And so it's almost impossible. I'm sure you're finding it's almost impossible to separate, this is the role that religion will have in the pandemic, and this is the role that Black Lives Matter will have in the pandemic, and this is the role that the environment will have in the pandemic, and X, Y, Z. And then in regards to voting as well, all of those factors, none of it's really separate anymore. I'm sure is what you're finding is all interweaved, and will all create a very interesting election day. So speaking of which, this is probably a bit of a cheeky question, but if you had to guess, who do you think will be winning this election? Would you have any idea?
Yeah, I do. I do think, and I hope that we see folks vote out Donald Trump. It's very clear who Donald Trump is. We know who Donald Trump is, and this election is about who we are and who we want to be as a country. So I always think of my friend's kid who said, we have to remember God loves Donald Trump. And I think that's true. God's grace is big enough for Donald Trump. If it's not big enough for Donald Trump, it's not big enough for any of us, right? But God, Donald Trump needs Jesus. That's clear. His life right now looks more like the 7 deadly sins than the fruits of the Spirit. And Jesus said the tree is known by its fruit. So I'm not judging him. I'm just saying I think he needs Jesus just like I do. But right now we need a new president. I'm very hopeful that we will see some change. But here's the deal: is I think that as a Christian, I have sort of a calculated hope.
Yeah.
I don't think that a new president's going to change 400 years of racism and all the things that we're seeing surface in our country. I think that it's going to take a lot of time and diligence to heal those wounds and address the really important issues that have been raised in this election. However, I do think that this is a pivotal moment, for our country where it does feel like we've got a choice between love and fear. And there's that beautiful scripture that says, perfect love casteth out fear. So we've been inviting people, choose love. Like we want to imagine this country driven more by love than by fear. And that's, I think, really what's at stake in this election.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. That's really beautifully put. Well, thank you so much, Shane. I feel like I could pick your brains for hours, but definitely got to draw our time to a close. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you to everyone for watching.
Thank you, Rebecca. See ya.
Now we must say our goodbyes. So thank you, Lee. Thank you, University of South Wales, BISA, City University of London, for this great opportunity. And this was the end of UEA's section on the role of religion in the US politics. Thanks for listening and have a good night.